Okay, so we've derived this formula. Everything seemed just great, and I'm here to tell you that this is all just really, truly garbage, and no one would ever do this. Or at least you won't get published in any kind of journal doing this kind of stuff. And here's why. So we were doing this so that we could estimate the mean for the entire population, right? Not just for the sample. If I just want the sample, here it is. It's for the entire population. And what I've got here in my formula is the standard deviation for the entire population. Now, if you think back to our first time talking about these measures of a mean and standard deviation, a mean is a fairly simple thing to calculate. A standard deviation is fairly hideous and actually has a mean in the formula for it. So I kind of need to know the mean to find the standard deviation. So how am I going to have this thing if I don't already have the population mean? Like, this is an unreasonable situation. Someone figured that out a long time ago. And honestly, people knew that. They just didn't know how bad this estimate really was until somebody named William Gossett came about and said, yeah, let's really do this the right way, though. We don't know this thing. Everyone was just sticking in the sample standard deviation for this and saying, we're fine, it's good. And it turns out that no, it's really not good. This is, right, when we claim that we've got a 95% confidence interval, we're claiming that 95% of the time, when we construct that 95% confidence interval, it's actually going to have the true value of the parameter in it. And it's actually way lower than that when I just stick in a sample standard deviation into this formula and treat it like nothing is wrong. All right, so we can't do this. We really should be using when we don't know this, and we will just about never know this. I'm going to need to use the sample standard deviation there. But now that adds an extra level of complication to this. Why? Because now I'm really using this to estimate this. Well, I'm using my sample standard deviation to estimate my population standard deviation, while I'm using my sample mean to estimate the population mean. So now I'm estimating really two things at once instead of one thing. That is harder, and more importantly, it's going to add a larger margin of error into my calculations, because I could be off, like this thing could be off from its true value, just like the sample mean can be off from the true value of the population mean. So there's going to be some extra wiggle room added in here. And it turns out that when I start using this, my sample mean's no longer normally distributed. It follows what's called a student's t distribution. So this guy, William Gossett, that actually derived all this stuff, worked for Guinness Brewery, who considered all this to be a trade secret. They didn't want it getting out to all the other competitors, so he published under the name Student to kind of keep everything secret about how they were actually using this within their own quality control and all that stuff. So that's why it's called a student's t distribution. And this is going to be what we use. All right? So this is nice because we can derive it fairly simply. This is a lot harder to get through, but it has the problem that we need to know this population standard deviation. And the population standard deviation is, I will say, occasionally allowed. Like, for example, when we have actually literally like census level data, which does happen, or something so large we can treat it like a census, then maybe just using this is reasonable. Like from some previous huge, like large study, maybe we could just use the standard deviation from that one and treat it like its population level because it's such a large study or a census before that. Or if there's just kind of like a known value for this, right? Like for IQ scores, we know that the population standard deviation is 15 for IQ scores. And so if I'm looking for generalized IQ scores, I can maybe use that 15. But those situations are going to be very rare to come by, and it's still probably better practice to use this anyway, even if I could get away with using this. So this is going to be generally what we do moving forward. But for right now, I just want us to understand that this is the problem with this. This is our solution, is by using the sample standard deviation, and this is actually how I pick between the two. So as you can probably guess, Minitab will handle these for us, or any software would. The difference is whether we pick to make a Z confidence interval or a T confidence interval. And we're always going to have the sample standard deviation, right? Even in this case, I could just calculate it, right? I've gathered a sample, I calculated a mean, and I've got a sample size, I've got a sample. I could calculate our sample standard deviation. So having a sample standard deviation does not tell us which one of these I want to pick. It's whether I have this thing, right? If I've got the population standard deviation, okay, go ahead and do this. If I don't have it, I've only got sample data, I need to construct a T interval instead. All right, so let me just demonstrate one last thing before we move on with this, which is what this T distribution also adds. So bell curves only had a mean and a standard deviation for what would change about it, and we actually, as we derived our confidence interval, we standardized it to only so that we're only ever looking at normal distributions with a mean of 0, standard deviation of 1. So really just 1. But now that we are looking at a T distribution, this actually always stays centered at 0, kind of like that standardized normal distribution for z-scores, but it actually changes shape, how thick these tails are, according to how large our sample size is. And so this has a parameter, just like our normal distribution had a mean and a standard deviation. This has a parameter called the degrees of freedom, which is just our sample size minus 1. Right, so let me write that up here just so we've got that. For the T, our degrees of freedom, which we usually just write df, is our sample size minus 1. And if I had to actually find this T value right here, which we're not, we're going to let software do it for us. If I had to find that, I would need to know these degrees of freedom in order to find that, right? Because this is the T value when I've got this alpha over 2 area to the left, right? And that area is going to change by how thick these tails are. And what really is going to happen is that when I've got a small number of degrees of freedom, that would be this blue shortest curve here, I've got thicker tails. And that's going to end up making a wider interval. I hope that this actually makes a little bit of intuitive sense, not just mathematical. Right? We can see that with the shapes of the curves. But if I actually have smaller sample sizes, I have less information. I actually would expect that my margin of error would be bigger with less information. And when I get more information, more data, I expect that my margin of error will get smaller, that I'll get a more precise estimate. And that's just what's happening with these degrees of freedom in this T distribution. I really don't want to get into the details of it, because I think it's easy enough to actually just implement it and use it in practice, that we don't really need to worry about all that derivation in our course. But we should at least know that there's this extra thing called degrees of freedom when we have, when we're working with this student's T distribution instead of a normal distribution like we have with this Z.